Music licensing is a natural outgrowth of copyright, commercial activity, and the transaction through which interested users can obtain a lawful use of the copyrighted material, and the copyright owners can obtain a financial benefit from their creations. It is at the very heart of the music publishing industry, carried out as the central business activity and the basis of the main source of income for the music publishing companies. As such, it must be understood in order to understand the music publishing itself. Now, there are two broad categories of music licenses: those that are compulsory in nature and those that are not. The compulsory licenses are regulated by law and cannot be refused, but usually require a legally determined payment or a fee with some predetermined parameters. The non-compulsory licenses are by definition not mandatory and can thus be granted or refused by the copyright owner and freely negotiated. So we need to remember that compulsory in this context does not mean that some licenses are required by the users and some not, but that some can be refused and are freely negotiated, and some cannot be refused and are statutory. See, all of these licenses are required in order to use the copyrighted music in ways that we will talk about. Since the two types of musical creations, musical works and sound recordings, are covered by different rights, those different rights imply different types of the resulting licenses necessary for the lawful use of the respective musical creations. Now, every music license is therefore defined by and depends on what type of musical creation will be used and how it will be used. In case of musical works, there are a number of different licenses in use today, some compulsory and some non-compulsory. We will list them and define them all here briefly, and may come back to the ones relevant to different business methods and practices as we cover different portions of the music industry throughout this course. We'll start with the oldest musical works license still in use today, the music print license. This is a non-compulsory license, negotiated freely, and can be granted or refused by the composers and the publishers. It is required in order to do any and all type of printing and distributing in print of the copyrighted musical compositions, including lyrics. This license is usually payable by the licensees directly to the publishers representing the composers whose material is being used in this way. The next music license in use today is the public performance license. Public performance license is a compulsory license required in order to publicly perform a musical work, including radio, television, and internet broadcasting. The terms and the rates of this license are legally controlled by the so-called performance rights consent decrees, not strictly determining them, but requiring the licensing entities to keep the rates reasonable and competitive. Now, ordinarily, the collecting entities for this license are the performance rights organizations, or PROs, which represent composers and their publishers for the purpose of the performance rights licensing. The paying licensees for this license are normally radio and television broadcasting companies, internet broadcasters, and businesses that utilize music publicly, clubs, restaurants, music venues, etc. The payments are made directly to the PROs who collect them and distribute them to their authors and publishers. So as we can see, the performance rights belonging to the owners of the musical works or music compositions, right, are largely licensed and administered by the performance rights organizations. Most of the authors and publishers are members of the PROs, and the PROs, as we said, represent authors and publishers in the performance rights licensing transactions. There are 3 PROs in the United States, as we said before: ASCAP, American Society of Composers, Authors and Publishers; BMI, Broadcast Music Incorporated; and SESAC, originally an acronym for Society of European Stage Authors and Composers, but now just SESAC and not an abbreviation for anything. All 3, perform the same commercial function across the music markets, which is the performance rights licensing of musical works on behalf of their members, though they do have different histories, organization, traditions, and somewhat different scope and reach. Regardless of these differences, though, all three are legally authorized and commercially capable of administering all types of the performance rights licensing of the musical works. Normally, authors under contract with the publisher either join the same PRO of which their publisher is a member, or the publisher has the company divisions that belong to different PROs, so the authors under contract can stay with the PRO of which they are already members. The author's compositions belonging to a publisher are registered with the publisher's PRO as belonging to the publisher's catalog, noting the names of the relevant individuals as the authors. Now, any income collected by the PRO for the licensing of the registered compositions is forwarded to the authors and the publishers of those compositions, generally as a 50-50 split. Authors receive 50% of the income and publishers receive another 50%. The PROs do keep a percentage of the collected income for their operating expenses, so the total of the authors-publisher split is diminished by that amount. The exception to this 50-50 split is made for the so-called split publishing agreements and co-publishing agreements between the authors and the publishers, where the split is structured differently and which we will cover a bit later in this module. The performance rights licensing of the musical compositions administered by the PROs includes the licensing of the use of the musical compositions in all the performance categories: live, terrestrial broadcasting or analog broadcasting, and digital broadcasting. The live performance categories include live music performed in any public, for-profit or non-for-profit context, such as musicians performing live in restaurants, bars, clubs, music venues, and music recorded or broadcasted but played in the public context, like CDs, tapes, records, MP3s, DVDs, etc., played publicly, and radio and television broadcasts played publicly. The licensing requirements in this subcategory are legally defined and conditioned by the size of the business establishments where music is played and by the number and the size of the music reproduction devices used. It is also relevant if the performance is done in the non-for-profit or for-profit context. Now notice that what is considered a public performance here also includes public playing of the existing music recordings and broadcasts. Now that's because, as we said earlier, every recording or a broadcast of a song inevitably contains the composition of that song in it. And every public performance of the copyrighted composition has to be licensed through this type of a license. Now, as we already mentioned, those responsible to obtain this license in this category are all the businesses that use live, recorded, or broadcasted music in their establishments, normally clubs, restaurants, bars, music venues, etc. The terrestrial or analog broadcasting performance category that we mentioned includes regular, non-digital television broadcasting and regular, non-digital radio broadcasting. While the digital broadcasting performance category includes digital cable, internet and satellite television broadcasting, and radio type broadcasting via internet and satellite. Those responsible for obtaining the license in these categories are normally radio and television broadcasting companies, cable operators, and internet broadcasters that use music in their broadcasts. On the other hand, the musical compositions contained in the cable and satellite systems retransmission of the primary television station broadcasts are licensed through the secondary transmission license. This is a compulsory license required in order to use a musical work in a secondary cable and satellite transmission of the primary TV station's broadcast. The terms and the rates for this license are determined and periodically adjusted by the Royalty Copyright Board. The license royalties are paid by the cable and satellite system operators to the Copyright Office and distributed to the PROs who collect them on behalf of the authors and publishers. Additionally, the non-commercial radio and television broadcasting is covered by a different type of license. Non-commercial public radio and TV license is a compulsory license resulting from the Copyright Act's provision for statutory licensing of musical works for the purpose of public radio and television broadcasting. In 2004, the responsibility for determining the terms and the rates for this license was transferred from the Librarian of Congress to the Copyright Royalties Board. The royalties for this license are paid by the non-commercial public and radio and TV operators to the Copyright Office and distributed in turn to the PROs who collect them on behalf of the authors and the publishers.